And welcome to another fabulous episode of Retrovaniacs. Actually, the 50th episode of Retrovaniacs. And as in the other 49, I'm Jeremy Parmentier here with Jeremy Gregory.
Hey, guys.
And most weeks, Billy Holiday.
Hello there.
And this week we're going to look at two different games from the Earthworm Jim series, the only two you'd actually want to cover. But until we get to that, first I do want to thank everyone who listens to the podcast. It's been 50 episodes. I honestly wasn't sure how long we were going to do this for, if it was going to work, if it was going to be even worth continuing on. But I've enjoyed it. I hope everyone else has enjoyed listening to it. And I hope that both Billy and Jeremy don't hate me for all the games we're picking. But I do want to thank everyone for listening.
I know it was pretty shaky after that General Chaos episode if we were actually going to continue doing this. But yeah, I enjoy doing it. It's been fun since we started doing this. So hopefully we can keep doing it.
Yeah, and it's been a great time and a tremendous response to it also. I'd like to thank everybody that's listened in, whether it's been via the podcast or YouTube or wherever. But yeah, I feel like we're just scratching the surface so far.
Well, I did do some research. It turns out there's a lot more than 50 retro games, so we have plenty more to go through before we run out of material, which is a nice treat for this sort of podcast.
I think the question is, how many TurboGrafx 16 gems from your childhood remain?
Oh, man, I've got a whole sheet of them, but not this week. This week we're not going to do one of those. We're going to, again, talk about Earthworm Jim on the Sega Genesis / Super Nintendo. But before we do that, Billy, what have you been playing since last episode?
The PlayStation over on the PSN, they've had a couple sales in a row, and I pick a few things up here and there, things I've looked at over the months, but didn't want to plunk down full price for. I got a game, Abzu. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's ABZU. So I feel pretty confident. And it was I love my walking simulators. It's been well documented. This is more of a swimming simulator. It took maybe 2 or 3 hours to play through. I sat down in one day and got through it. It was enjoyable enough. Other than that, I picked up a game also on sale called The Flame and the Flood. And this is one of those, roguelike deals. You play a girl and a dog that must traverse a flooded world, stop at various places to pick up supplies. It's a little bit like Don't Starve, except out on the river. And I have enjoyed that one quite a bit, even though it carries a difficulty to it, but not frustratingly so. I've been playing those two a little bit, and otherwise I just haven't had as much time as I'd want. But I played through both games for this, and that took up a little bit of my time.
Yeah, I definitely put a lot of time into these two games. I've played the first one many times, but I actually never finished the second one. Got to the later levels till we worked on this podcast. So I did put a lot of time into that. I did finish Persona 5. I know at the last episode I had said I was at the very end. Well, I finished that pretty much the day after we recorded. And then I made the mistake. I try to focus on 1 to 2 games at a time, or else I never finish anything. I like to have one console game and one handheld game, and I kind of focus on that set of 2 instead. I'll just play a million games. But instead, after I finished Persona, I just started dabbling and playing like 5 minutes of a bunch of different games, and then I realized what I was doing again, and so I decided to focus. But that's a fairly new focus for the last 3 days. So I downloaded again from the PS4 sale. I got the Ratchet and Clank remake, restart, reimagining, whatever it is. Excellent. I was a big fan of the series anyway, but it's definitely a nice take on the story from the first game. I'm not super far in. I think I'm 4 or 5 hours in total, but it's still excellent game. Loving that. And then for handhelds, I don't know why I downloaded the Ys 4 remake for the Vita a long time ago, and I love that series. I played Ys Book 1 and 2 on my TurboGrafx many times, and then I like the other entries in the series, but 4 never came out in the U.S. until the Vita version. So I downloaded it when I first got my Vita and then never played it. Like, I started, I was like, I'll get back to this later. So I've been focused on that a lot, and it's good. It's very good. I don't know if you like the Ys series at all, either of you guys, but it's a simpler action. I mean, it's a simpler RPG, action RPG. It's more RPG than like a Zelda, but it's still a lot more like you push the button, you swing your sword. It's not like you have a whole lot of stats to mess with other than just you get stronger and stronger and stronger as the game progresses. But you do get new weapons and armors and things. But that's really what I've been focusing on, those two. And again, until I buy 100 more games on this sale, because I think there's another 2 weeks left on this sale, and I guarantee I'm going to buy 50,000 things. So what about you, Jeremy?
Well, for me, I guess since we had to kind of put this podcast off about a week, I was able to grab the new Diablo 3 Necromancer pack. And I was a huge fan of the Necromancer in Diablo 2. That was my favorite class. And not having it in 3 really hurt. There really wasn't much of any character in 3 that I actually enjoyed playing. So when this one came out, I grabbed it. It's like $15. Man, it's made me realize just how much I miss Diablo 2. This is it's basically the Necromancer from Diablo 2, but it's been heavily reworked with several different new abilities that you can use and go about getting through the game with. Of course, you got your corpse explosion and all that stuff, bloody mess. But there's also a hell of a lot more with him being able to raise minions like skeletons and golems and things like that to help you along. For me, I'm just sticking with my corpse explosions because that's what I'm all about. And I've been having a lot more fun going through Diablo 3 with this guy than the previous characters that I tried, which was like the Barbarian and the Demon Hunter. And that they're not too bad, but the Necromancer is the way to go if you were a fan of that class back in Diablo 2. Besides that, I really haven't been playing too much. That's just about it. And like I said, besides these 2 games, which is surprisingly taken up a decent amount of time, especially for that second game.
I definitely played a lot of Diablo 3 when it first came out. I liked it a lot. I actually did play a Barbarian the whole way through, and then I started everybody at some point, every one of the classes. But I hadn't done any of the expansions at all. I don't know why it didn't grab me. I mean, I had a good time with it, but it was like once I finished it, I was like, that was fun. Never went back. But I enjoyed it. It was a good time.
I mean, that's about how I was when I first got it. If you haven't played it since then, they've really turned that game around, because I was very underwhelmed with Diablo 3 back when it first came out. It was fun enough, but it was definitely like it just didn't grab me. The whole auction house thing basically just broke the game immediately. But since then, they've closed that down. They brought out that one expansion pack for it, and now the Necromancer. And this game I could definitely see it being put on the same level as Diablo 2 in terms of just how much content's there and how much fun it is to play.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thankfully this week we're going to play a game that has no expansion packs because it's too old for that sort of technology. Earthworm Jim 1 and 2 for mostly the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo.
This was one I was very excited about. For the 50th episode, we wanted to go with something maybe not completely obscure, but not something that, not one of the major series. And I think this was a perfect choice. Loved the first game, played through it many times as a child, but surprisingly so, never touched the second one.
It's about the same boat that I'm in. I was all about Earthworm Jim back when I was a kid. The first game, and like you, I played through it several times, but I don't know if the second game just came out at a weird time or what, but I never touched it.
Well, it came out. I mean, or the original Earthworm Jim came out in 1994, and the sequel came out a year later. So, unfortunately, it's the same time frame as the PlayStation, the Saturn. The next whole generation had started. So, unless you were one of those people that held off due to just not wanting the newest system or not having the money to get the newest system, then you probably didn't rush to find the sequel to Earthworm Jim on either of those two consoles. You were busy playing some terrible 3D game that didn't age very well. I know I definitely did the same myself, although I got Earthworm Jim 2 years later because I was still working at the electronics boutique, and people would trade in games, and for a long time you could kind of game the system to get things you wanted for prices they probably shouldn't be. So I had basically every game I wanted for the Super Nintendo and Genesis that you could get at some point during that 5-year window. And I definitely played a lot of this. I remember I never finished Earthworm Jim 2, and I couldn't remember why. Playing through, I did figure out why and where I got stuck before. And we'll get to that. But first, we'll cover the original Earthworm Jim. Like I said, it came out in 1994, originally just for the Sega Genesis. Later on, ported to the Super Nintendo, Game Boy, Game Gear, Master System, and PCs, and even the Game Boy Advanced far after that. It's one of the first games by Shiny Entertainment. Shiny Entertainment was David Perry. It was his company. They went to make other games that were, I think, pretty inventive and great. MDK, Wild 9 are the two that I played a lot of both of those games. But this was their first one. It's their big, iconic game. And again, I don't know if it's something that was just that time frame, because I know every 8-bit systems, even and after that, still had the idea of having, the iconic franchise character. But something about 16-bit era was like everybody had one. Every company wanted their own mascot. Every company wanted their own hit Mario-style character. That's where we get the guys like Bubsy and all these other forgotten guys. Arrow the Acrobat, all these other characters no one remembers anymore. But Earthworm Jim was one that came out that stuck, and he was cool, but without being extreme to the edge. He was just funny. It was a funny character, a dumb backstory. It didn't need anything other than just, does this game play well? Oh, it does? Good. Also, this guy's interesting, and he's not what you'd expect. It's a 2D platformer at its core, with the ability to shoot, but it's not like a run and gun like Contra necessarily. It's still, you've got to have some good platforming skills, and the maps are a lot more all over the place. A very Genesis-style map system, where the map goes back and forth and up and down all around the screen. It's not like just you start at the left side and you end up at the right side. All these maps are involved and inventive. Some are a little confusing because of how they're shaped, because they're all on other planets, so you don't have to follow any kind of physics we see here on Earth. But the character himself is what makes this game memorable. You're an earthworm in a magical spacesuit that turns him into kind of a half-human, half-earthworm. That's all you need to know. You don't need any other backstory at all. They try to give you some backstory, but it's just as dumb as anything you could think of involving an earthworm with a magical spacesuit.
Yeah, and that's pretty much, that sold me as a kid. The fact that it's a fucking earthworm. It just happened upon this suit, and there's your character. There's nothing in depth. And yeah, at the time, I mean, you had seen a lot of these, attempts at mascots, usually an animal. Most of the time they had a shirt on. Usually you toss a shirt on them, or just one article of clothing, something. And but yeah, this is the first time there's ever a fucking this fucking worm, and that was a big deal to me as a kid at the time. And I'm pretty sure this is one of those where the box and name alone got this as the rental for the first time around. But I remember just renting this damn thing over and over, because this was not one of those where the box was excellent, you got it home and you were let down. This was a solid one through and through.
Yeah, no, that's about the same with me. There's just something about it, the humor in it. Shiny Entertainment, whether you like their style of games or not, you can't deny that they've got a hell of a sense of humor for just about every game they put out. A kind of a dark sense of humor, and even though the game and character is all crazy and stuff like that, it's still it's got this random humor to it that's so good. You just want to get to the next stage just to see what crazy things that Earthworm Jim himself will do, what kind of bosses you're going to get into, and there's usually an awesome payoff, and that's the thing I remember most as a kid playing this game. It was not so much the act of playing it, but just how much I enjoyed getting through the game and seeing all the crazy stuff that they put in it.
It's definitely one of those games where if you have the manual, you should read it. And if you don't have the manual, go find the PDF of it read it online even if you're not going to play the game, because it's actually got the manual start to finish is interesting. It's amusing. They name all the characters things that you totally expect them to be named. I mean, Earthworm Jim fights against his main villain, I guess, is Psy Crow, who's a space crow, because he's a worm. Worms hate crows, so why not fight a space crow? The main enemy you're supposed to be stopping is Queen Slug for a Butt, who is a queen who's literally got a slug for a butt, and she's massive. She sounds exactly like what you'd imagine her looking like. You fight Professor Monkey for a head, who's a professor with a monkey for a head. It's the kind of thing that you can totally see guys just like, hey, here we just threw these guys in here. It's amazing, and that's the same kind of things that you saw in Wild 9, MDK, and even Doug Tennapel is actually the creator of Earthworm Jim, the character, and he voiced the character. He began after this game, the Neverhood, so that we did Skull Monkeys earlier this year. That's the same kind of game, same kind of feeling. This is exactly that style game. It's great. I mean, the book itself, if you don't have any interest in playing the game, at least look at the book and read it, because it'll fill you in on all the things that you'd never know by playing the game. In fact, the second game's worse than the first for that. The second game, without the manual, doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But we'll get to that in a minute. I jumped ahead of the gun there, but did you guys finish this before this podcast?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd finished this. I know they did an HD remake of this a couple years ago, and I did again then, too. It's not just that it's fun to play and it is worth seeing. Oh, let's see what's going to happen next. But every level is different. Every level, even if it's got the same kind of large kind of confusing map, they all have their own tweaks to each level that make each of them worth playing. For example, the first level is just New Junk City. It's exactly what you want it to be. It's a good starter level. It introduces you to the mechanics of the game himself. Jim really only has a handful of abilities in the first game. He can shoot his blaster, and you can find some power-ups to that blaster that you can use. They're limited uses, but they're spread out throughout the maps pretty well. You can whip your head, like the worm head, to grab onto things, or as a weapon, so you can use it like to swing from like Pitfall on different parts of the level. And then you can also jump, and then if you hold that button while you jump, you turn your head into a helicopter by flipping your worm head around, and it helps you glide around the level. Those are the main moves that Jim has in the basic levels. Yeah. And that first level really just shows you kind of how to use all those things. There's like wires you can hang on in parts of the level as well. I mean, it just shows you the mechanics of the game basically, but still throughout the whole thing. I mean, even when you first start the level, I guess the first few minutes of the first level, you walk to the side and you shoot this cow way up in the air, and it just says "cow launched," and that's not referenced again for quite some time, and you're not really even sure why you did it. I mean, you'd think it's going to happen again in the level, or maybe the next level after that, but no. That for a long time I just thought it was just funny, like, okay, cow launched, why not? No problem. But that level is a good introduction, and then in between that level and the next level, this kind of first-person-y tunnel game where you're avoiding asteroids and picking up these little blue balls while you race against Psy-Crow. And it's called Anti-Asteroids, and you do it a bunch of times. So hopefully you enjoy it, because you're going to do it between every single level, all the way from the start of the game to the end of the game. I like that minigame. I mean, I don't even know if you'd call it a minigame, but I thought that was actually pretty fun.
Yeah, I mean, I highly enjoyed that. The fucking, and we'll talk about it more, but the music in this game, excellent, and it varies so much from stage to stage. And this one has a very, very frantic pace to it, because I mean it's a high speed race on there, and it's very enjoyable, which is good because you, like you said, you play this damn thing several times over. But in this, and like you're talking about the beginning, with Jim's attacks, they're very few, and it does a good job of teaching you. And the first thing I noticed, and this is something I remembered from back at the time, was just how smooth this damn game controls. I played on the Super Nintendo, which I heard has a little slowdown to it. Never played the Genesis version, but I thought even then on there, this is a very responsive, very easy to control game.
Yeah, that's I mean, it's very smooth. I think for me, like, I definitely had problems with just how animated Jim is. And if you've played Earthworm Jim, that's one of the main selling points to this game. Not only is the character himself insane, but the animation in this game, Shiny Entertainment, they kind of that's what they were known for. They were also, I don't think they were shiny when they did Aladdin for the Genesis, but that was still David Perry, and they worked with a lot of hand-drawn animation for that game, and that carries over to Earthworm Jim as well. But it also kind of brings that weird, overly animated character. And for me, when I was a kid, there were definitely a lot of times where he's maybe just a bit too animated, and I was actually like missing some jumps here and there just because I wasn't quite sure where his animation was going to land at the time. Eventually, you get used to it. But yeah, that one was. It is a very, very smooth game. It controls really well, but his animation is just kind of all over the place.
Well, it's another one of the games where you want to just stand still for a second because Jim will do a bunch of different things while he's just standing there idle waiting for you to do something.
Oh, yeah.
But aside from that, you're right. Everything you do in the game is animated really well. I think the jumping's a little bit floaty, like you said, but it's less of an issue on the Genesis version than the Super Nintendo. I had only played this on Genesis before until the HD remake. I had it on the Sega CD Special Edition that had come out.
Ooh, can't hide money.
Well, when you're one of the 17 people with a Sega CD, you buy games for it because you want to feel good about it. And if it wasn't, I had all those RPGs, the Lunars and stuff, but other than that, I didn't have a lot of games on that were worth playing.
I played Slam City with Scottie Pippen all the time on there, so I understand.
You understand quality. I get that. But on the Genesis, I thought it controlled a little bit better than on the Super Nintendo. It's one of the few games I'd actually say I prefer on the Genesis than the Super Nintendo. But it's...
I mean, that's the crazy thing. Is like, you grow up, back when I was a kid, generally 90% of the time, the better version was on the Sega or the Super Nintendo. Mm-hmm. And I went through childhood and most of adulthood thinking that I played the superior version of Earthworm Jim on the Super Nintendo. Mm-hmm. And turns out, no, it's just a little bit easier to control. It's not any faster, but it seems like the response time on the Genesis is a little bit better. And also, the Super NES version, the picture itself is just a bit zoomed in and stretched, which, with how kind of floaty the controls are and how all over the place the levels are anyway, it can make some of those jumps harder to see than what they actually are on the Genesis, which is it's got a proper format to it and it's not stretched. So I went back and played a few levels of the Genesis for this podcast. I was like, geez, this is the one to have right here.
Yeah, it's definitely the Genesis I think handles better, and in fact, the Sega CD version actually has some extra levels that aren't in the standard Genesis release or in the Super Nintendo release. So you go through New York City, and then there's that asteroid level, and then there's a level called What the Heck, where you kind of go through what kind of looks like an outer space fire planet, but I think is supposed to be hell. I'm not really sure because you fight Hell the Cat at the end. After that, on the other versions of the game, another asteroids level, but then you go to a level called Down the Tubes where you're underwater and you have to constantly dodge these giant cats and hide from them almost. Instead, on the Sega CD version, there's a level called Big Broody. And Big Broody is another kind of level that's set up like What the Heck or New Junk City, except that this big red monster called Big Broody is all throughout the level. And if you come close enough to him, he'll sniff you and then just kind of charge your direction. And you need to use that character. One, you have to avoid him because he'll kill you in one hit. But then you also have to have him like charge you and then jump out of his way so he'll knock over walls to get through the level, or launch you into the air if he can get him to fall on a platform that you're on the other side of. I mean, it's an interesting level. It's an interesting mechanic. It's kind of frustrating. It's not worth hunting down the Sega CD version just for that. But it's nice to see an exclusive level that I did play and is not in any other version of this game. But that's... So, after Big Broody, then you go Down the Tubes, and the game continues as normal from there. Down the Tubes has my favorite boss fight in any game ever, where you fight against Bob the Goldfish.
Yes, yeah.
Because Bob the Goldfish's main fight is you run into a room, and he's a goldfish and a little goldfish bowl on the pedestal, and it's like, fight! And you run up and you just push over the pedestal, and he falls to the ground because he's a goldfish. What's he going to do? And the level ends, and of course, you get on your rocket ship bike or whatever and fly on to the next anti-asteroids level.
Even as a kid, I felt pretty damn shitty doing that. It's another one. I had trouble with that when I was younger, and even now. And now I recall, it's like, oh shit, what a fucking jerk move.
It's kind of a one-sided fight.
Well, yeah, it's thankfully, because there's some other fights that are a lot tougher than that. There's another bunch of levels in this game. There's a total of 10 levels on the standard version, 12 on the special edition version, because there's actually 2 New Junk Cities in the Sega CD special edition version. But the level I want to talk about, unless you guys want to go through those other levels on the way, is the For Pete's Sake level with Peter Puppy.
Oh, man.
Oh, boy.
Before I just get all over this game for that fucking level on its own, I would like to say one of my favorite levels in the entire game is the bungee jumping boss.
Yes.
And that one as a kid blew me away. That level is so good. I wish I wish there was kind of more just fun boss fights like that in the game. If you've never played it, it's basically you and this slime monster boss that you're fighting are on bungee cords, and you're going up and down. And basically the idea is to hit each other into the rocks on each side of the screen. Mm-hmm. And as you do that, the rope or the slime will come undone, and whoever rips it apart, they lose, or you win. But that was probably my favorite level in the whole game. And it just kind of sucked that when you do get to For Pete's Sake, that it just makes you kind of forget all those really fun levels before it, because you get so fucking frustrated with just this one level.
It's easily the hardest level in the game. It's I don't even want to call it an escort mission, because it's not really an escort mission. Peter Puppy is this little dog character who will slowly walk from one side of the level to the other, and your job is to protect him by shooting things and making him stop before he walks off a cliff. You can whip him with your head, and that'll make him jump really high to get over things like pits. But if you fail at something, if you get him hit, if he falls into a pit, instead of the level immediately ending, which would be actually... that would be worse, so I'm glad that doesn't happen. But instead, he kind of turns into this Frankenstein's monster, giant purple dog man, and immediately attacks you for failing to protect him, doing a sizable chunk out of your life, and then turn back into Peter Puppy and slowly starts again, wandering from the left side to the right side. And it's a long level. It's super long. There aren't enough checkpoints for me in that level at all for the kind of level that it is, and a lot of it is you're going to fail a bunch until you memorize the level. There's not too many parts of this game that fall into that category that you have to memorize. It's something that I don't think is a major deal, but a lot of current games don't make you do that. A lot of current games, you can see enough ahead, or there's things that'll kind of teach you what to do. This is definitely start to finish memorization and repetition and just frustration nonstop.
And it's the only part in the whole game that really pulls this on you. I think up until this point, it's not that hard of a game. It's definitely got some challenge to it, and some the platforming can be a little bit can be a bit rough, but nothing on this level that, as far as like the frustration levels, it really got to me as a kid. I did end up beating the game several times just because you do eventually just memorize what you have to do and you can blow through it. But man, those first few times playing that game, that stage is the one that I don't ever want to play.
And this was one of the first thoughts that came to my head when it was mentioned we were going to play Earthworm Jim. After the excitement died down, it hit me. Oh shit!
Yep.
About that level, that fucking level. As a kid, this is where it ended. Most of the time when I rented this game, this is where I dropped off at, and I took it back in. It wasn't until I actually got my parents to buy it later on that I had the time to sit down, memorize. This is probably one of those where I've got a fucking sheet of notebook paper somewhere with some notes taken down. Yeah, I mean, this is you're not going to get through this on your first go. You're not going to get through it on the second. You're going to lose on this stage many a time, and it's just not fun. And it's plopped right down in the middle of what is otherwise just an extremely fun, not overly difficult game. It's out of nowhere.
As much as it's frustrating, as much as I don't like this level, it does play well. Like it's made well. It's not like at any point that I feel like I was losing because I missed what I was doing or I couldn't control it very well. It's extremely frustrating because it's supposed to be. And that's why I can put up with it. That's why I can deal with how difficult it is, and I'll work on it and I'll get through it because it's designed to be that frustrating. I don't know if I say that's good or bad, but it's not a matter of just, this is a good idea and it's implemented badly. It's implemented just fine. It's just that it's the most frustrating part of the game, hands down. And actually, once you get through this, there's only 2 more levels, depending which version of the game you're playing. There may only be 1 more level. and you're done. And that last level is a pretty straightforward platformer where you just shoot a bunch of things till eventually you fight Queen Slug for a butt. Take out Queen Slug for a butt to free her twin sister, who looks a lot more attractive and doesn't have a slug for a butt. And spoilers ahead of time, if you're going to play Earthworm Jim and you don't want this spoiled, this is where the cow comes back in. And I didn't realize that until I played it through this time, that's what happened. I don't know how I didn't pick up on this until this playthrough. But in the first level, you launch that cow into the air. And at the very end of the game,
that's a hell of
you
a
save the princess, and the cow falls on her at random. In my mind, as a kid, at random. And you're like, oh, that's hilarious because the rest of the game's hilarious. There's just things happen. And I didn't realize until this time through, I'm like, I bet that's the cow I launched on the first level. How dumb am I that I never pieced this together?
Wow.
I must have just been so blinded with rage for Pete's sake that I didn't piece together the first few levels. I totally forgot about them because I just had to make sure I go through that dog level.
Well, yeah, I mean, you've got to have some patience for that payoff. I mean, that's for something you literally do within the first 3 minutes of the first stage. Unless you're playing this all the way through in one sitting, you might forget that you even launched that cow. Because it just, as a kid, the first time you do it just seems like a nice little funny random piece of humor. But it does come back around at the end. One of the all-time great endings, in my opinion.
Well, it's a great game. I mean, I think it controls really well. I think it's funny the whole way through. I enjoy playing it. The only level that's annoying is that the Peter Puppy for Pete's sake level. But everything else, even the ones that are a little frustrating, are great. I think this is a classic game. I think it well deserves a sequel, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But it's also one that I think has aged perfectly well. I enjoyed playing it through this time. I enjoyed playing the HD remake that came out a couple years ago. I mean, I would love to see another Jim game at some point in the future that's not just a remake of the original, because this is a solid game, solid character with a lot of possibilities.
Yeah, and this was a hit with me. It was then, still is now. At no point in time did I doubt I was going to pick this game back up and not like it all these years later. This is a true classic from the 16-bit era. I think you are doing yourself a disservice if you are a platformer fan or just a fan of games with an odd sense of humor. You really need to go out and play this one.
I think the thing that actually surprised me the most, I knew I was going to still enjoy this game to this day, but I did not know how well the humor was going to hold up. And there was still a lot of times where I was, it had me actually laughing out loud just because I'd forgotten some of the random nonsense that's in this game. And but yeah, it's the whole thing somehow manages to hold up, even the humor, which is one of the hardest things to do in games.
Yes, well, especially if you're dealing in the mid-90s.
Oh yeah. I mean, otherwise you got like what, Booger Man or something like that. That was what humor was in video games for the most part. Very, very few games could do funny, and I think Earthworm Jim is probably the best.
Yeah.
So the sequel came out a year later. Earthworm Jim 2 definitely builds on ideas from the first. I think it goes a little crazy in a lot of parts, but neither of you guys had played this before this podcast, right?
No.
No.
So I had played it before. I got fairly far, but I guess what were your first, playing the first few levels, mainly once you get to the second level, I guess, Lorenzo's Soil. What did you think of the second game compared to the first? Just first. Jesus, I can't forget how to talk now. Hold on. Oh, let me try that with words that make sense. What were your first impressions of Earthworm Jim 2 versus Earthworm Jim 1?
For me, it starts off, and that's the key word here. It starts off as a much more just refined version of the first game, which is exactly what I wanted. Unfortunately, it does not stay like that. But for as far as playing it, this is very much like the first game with a few new added things that Jim can do.
Yeah, and instead of the first game, Jim could turn his head into a helicopter, and he was able to use his tail to whip things, which also grab things. This game simplifies it to some level. Now Jim only uses his tail to attack things. He only uses his head as a whip to attack things. But instead now he has this character Snot that rides in his backpack. Snot was not in the first game. Snot's just a big green ball of snot that rides in his backpack. He can use Snot. He launches it forward to grip onto what looks like goo hanging from ceilings in certain levels to then swing around on that, like Pitfall. And he also then uses Snot as a parachute instead of turning his head into a helicopter blade. But it serves the exact same purpose. The other major difference in what Jim can do in these standard Jim levels is there are a bunch of other optional power-up shots you find. So you'll walk along the level and you'll find a shot that looks like the top of a roof or whatever, and it's like a homing missile thing that shoots off. There are a three-way shot. There's a lot of optional guns that you can pick up that were not in the original game that are interesting. I mean, I don't think they're deal breakers or game changers necessarily, but it's interesting, and I think some of the guns are kind of funny.
Yeah, they didn't really. I mean, they're in there, and it's. I never really was like, oh man, I'm glad I picked that up. They just kind of seemed like they were there as like the game was like, well, we probably need some more power ups for the gun or something like that. But the game isn't action heavy enough for that to really matter. I mean, Jim's standard machine or laser gun, whatever the hell it is more than enough to get you through the game. It just seemed like the other stuff was just there to add a bit of variety to something that didn't really require variety.
Yeah, it wasn't something necessary, and yeah, nothing. I mean, it may be fun to shoot them off, see the animations and whatnot for them, but yeah, I never at any point in time felt undergunned with just the standard issue.
One of the main differences between the Sega Genesis version of Earthworm Jim 2 and the Super Nintendo version specifically is in the Super Nintendo version you could cycle through those weapon power-ups, so you could kind of save them, go back to your regular blaster, or make sure you use up certain ones in other spots. The Genesis version you can't. It's whatever you've picked up is what you can use, and then once they're gone, it goes back to your other gun. So there's no way to cycle through them. So it wasn't even like you need to save them. Oh, like these fights are going to be hard, I want to save these guns. In the Genesis version, it's obvious that you can't do that. So I think a lot of those guns are just there kind of for flavor. They make a few things easier, but they're not required to get through anything.
Mm-hmm. Also, if you're wondering, the same issues from the first Genesis and Super Nintendo version of the game, they are still there. The Super Nintendo is actually still zoomed in. It's not as bad as the first, and the colors. This almost looks like a whole different game on the Super Nintendo compared to like what the colors are on the Genesis. So if you thought this was going to be like a Mortal Kombat 2 situation where the Super Nintendo got the definitive version finally, no, it's still just a little bit too zoomed in for my comfort.
So the first level is pretty standard. It's what you'd expect a sequel to Earthworm Jim to be. The second level, they start mixing things up a little bit. The second level is called Lorenzo's Soil, and the whole mechanic of the level, first off, there's a time limit that you can find a lot of different clocks in the level to give you some more time, but there's a strict time limit you have to follow, which includes grabbing those times to extend it. And then you're just kind of blasting through, almost like if you're blasting through anthills, so you have to constantly dig your way to find new tunnels and uncover other tunnels by using your gun to blast a bunch of dirt out of the way above you. It's an interesting level. I don't think it's actually done very well. I think it's a kind of awkward. There's a lot of parts where if you're not shooting the exact right spot, the sand doesn't fall, it doesn't continue the passageway. You'll run out of time just based on being off by a pixel or two of a gun that doesn't have a clear firing range. When you fire Jim's blaster, sometimes you can just see him firing, and it kind of fires off in a direction, but it's not like it's a beam that you see clearly is going from point A to point B.
Yeah, and this seemed like the level where they were really wanting to show off what Snot can do, because you've got to use him a lot. And turns out he's not as accurate as you want him to. Well, you have to be extremely accurate with where you put the aim Snot so that you can make some of these jumps. And there were definitely a few times where I had to do it several times just to get Snot to hit where I needed him to hit, so I could launch Jim forward to grab onto the other pipe.
Yeah, my praise for the control in the first one doesn't carry over as much on this one. Yeah, I ran into a lot of issues like what Jeremy is talking about.
It's awkward, and I think a lot of the levels, the first game probably has 8 levels that I'd say are standard Earthworm Jim style platforming, map levels. Where this game, it's probably half of those levels and half almost like a collection of mini games, it feels like, in parts, or like, here's a bunch of cool ideas for levels. We don't need a story to tie them together. There is a story that ties it all together, but it's actually in the manual. Like, it tells you in the manual each level and kind of why you're there. So it's not, it doesn't tell you in the game why you're at certain levels. It doesn't tell you why you're digging your way out of this hole for the second level, and it clearly doesn't explain the next level, which is to replace. In the first game you had Andy Asteroids, where you do this tunnel dodging of asteroids. This game doesn't have that. Instead, the reoccurring level, which is thankfully not between every level, but enough times, is a Peter Puppy level. Now, again, that was the worst level in the first game, but instead of him going slowly from one side to the other while you dodge and hide and make sure he doesn't get hurt, instead, this is Psychro has his puppies. And he's throwing them out a window, and you have to catch them with this bouncy net and bounce them to the safety of Peter Puppy on the other side of the screen, which seems like it would be easy. It reminds me a lot of the, Circus Atari in some ways, but it gets more and more terrible in that there's 4, 5, 6 puppies going at one time, and you're literally trying to run to specific spots over and over again to stop the puppies from hitting the ground. Thankfully, it doesn't happen after 1 puppy hits the ground, but after 4 puppies have hit the ground, Peter Puppy again turns into this Frankenstein's monster purple dog and attacks you, doing a third of your life roughly, just under a third of your life. So if you have 100% of your life, he can turn into Frankenstein 3 times before it ends the level on you, and you lose a life if you miss that many dogs. And you have to continue to bounce these dogs between Psychro and the house and Peter Puppy until eventually Psychro throws a bomb. And you get the bomb to Peter Puppy, who then freaks out that he has a bomb and throws it back at Psychro and it explodes. And you have to go through, every time you come to one of these levels, 3 to 4 stages where each one has an increasing number of puppies. It's a long, kind of medium bonus level. I don't even know what you want to call it. They're long each time. They're not easy. I think they're the hardest parts of the game again, and probably the least fun.
Boy, let me tell you. Could have done without this. The Peter Puppy stage in the first one, it's a stage. You finish it, and that's it. This is not. This shit. And as enjoyable as the bonus stage was in the first one. Yeah, I genuinely like that one. This is it's a fucking slog. And when you finish a level, you start to tense up because you know it's coming.
It's so just, I mean, if you thought that you got to that second stage in this game and was thinking, well, maybe this is trying to do some things that just aren't quite what Earthworm Jim is, it's not playing to its strengths of being a fun action platformer. This is about you hit this stage and you're just like, oh no, this isn't what I wanted at all. Yeah, this is just a weird mini game. It's just awful, and it goes on forever. Every single time it's on there. This is not a quick, 2 or 3 minute thing. This can go on for like 7 to 8 minutes.
It takes as long as the stage.
Yeah, I mean,
it just finished. Yeah.
Oh God, this one, and you think that this is about as bad as it's going to get. Well, I mean, it is, yes, but the game still continues to surprise with some of the weird ass shit that it wants to throw at you, and the whole time, this was my. What just was in my head the entire time, for the most part, I was playing this game, was this is not the game I want to play. Like, I want to play Earthworm Jim. And for I swear, like 3/4 of this game, you're not playing Earthworm Jim.
Yeah, it's a bunch of bizarre, almost one-off levels, loosely tied together with a story that you need the manual to understand why you're going from place to place. The first level was the only real level we've talked about so far where it felt like an Earthworm Jim. Then you go through the Learners of Soil shooting the ground level, the puppy level. The next level is one where you play as a blind cave salamander that can slowly float around.
Jesus.
You have a gun, but it's not really a shooting level. You're kind of going through what looks like intestines, but also with pinball machine parts.
Yeah. And I'm gonna have to tell you what this reminds me of. Have any of you played fucking Bart's Nightmare?
Yes, it reminds me a lot of Bart's
Yes.
Nightmare.
Just
actually.
a series of just bizarre, very different mini games, which is just what this thing feels like. It's just everybody in working on this game had an idea. If you showed up, you got your idea put in. I don't fucking know how, but it just felt just like Bart's Nightmare, which actually at least has a shit. I didn't think I'd say anything good about that game. It just it had a little more reason to it. But as I played through it, I got that same bad taste in my mouth as when I played that game.
You're talking about this salamander stage. It doesn't just stop at that, being a weird blind cave salamander in an intestine or stomach or something that's also a pinball machine.
Mm-hmm.
You also get a quiz show in the same stage. And then after the quiz show, you have to do a memory game. It is just bizarre what they were thinking, trying to do this.
Yeah, this level's all over the place specifically. I mean, every part of the level. I mean, this is the level I remembered in the game when we were going to do this. I was like, I know I got pretty far, and I did beat this before. And the next levels after that level where you're the cave salamander, it's another normal Earthworm Jim style level. That's kind of a circus-based level. And then this is the level where I stopped before. And it's not that hard, but I guess I just decided I wasn't going to play this anymore at that point. The next level is called the Flying King, and it's a level where it's almost a 3/4 overhead shooter, like Viewpoint or Zaxxon, and it's not even a shooter, though, because, I mean, it is a shooter in some ways, but you're kind of bouncing this giant balloon that has a bomb on the bottom from one end of the stage to the other. And if you accidentally shoot that balloon, it explodes, and you have to go all the way back to the beginning. And if you lose track where the balloon is, you can turn around and head the other way to find it again. But I don't know what they were aiming at. It's kind of like, here's all these parts of the games that we can not do successfully. It's not a good shooter game level. It's not a good puzzle level. It's just this bizarre gauntlet of misery.
You didn't have to do this with Earthworm Jim. I always respect when someone makes a sequel and it's not just a carbon copy, But really, the first game was so solid. You had your base right there. You didn't have to, go to these lengths to freshen it up. Shit.
And that's what's so infuriating about it.
Yes,
I mean,
it's
it's not like they fucked up the first game and they were trying to throw everything at the wall to see what would hit this time. They made they made an all-time classic action platformer.
Yes.
And all they had to do with Earthworm Jim 2 is to keep doing that. Mm-hmm. Now, like you said, I appreciate them mixing things up, but there are just large swaths in this game where you don't actually get to play the game you wanted to rent or buy.
Again, it's not even like the sections make sense story-wise, so you don't really know why you're doing any of these things. It's just like, here's the level, here's what you do next. It does feel like if this was based on the cartoon show that they put out based on Earthworm Jim, and I don't think it is. I think the cartoon came out after this. But it would at least make more sense to me to say, I remember these episodes, and this is just a bunch of games based around episodes. But it's just a bunch of bizarre games tied together loosely. And like you said, you want this game to be something different than the first one, like a build on it. They don't need to go crazy with it, but just have some enhancements. The next level, and I think there's a puppy level in the middle here somewhere again, the second level of the puppy level, but I don't want to talk about those anymore. The next real level is the cow level. I liked the cow level, but I don't know if everyone else liked the cow level. It's another standard Earthworm Jim style map. But in order to progress through parts of the map, you have to find these cows and carry them to the barn so that they'll be milked in the barn, and all their milk will make a gate raise. I like this level. I thought this level was fun. It builds on what the other game did, but also adds kind of a puzzle element to it, while still keeping it to feel like a platformer. Like, if every level was interesting like this level, to me at least, I think it would have been a slam dunk game.
Yeah, I think this one, I was actually glad. I was probably just so glad to go back to an actual Earthworm Jim style stage.
Yeah.
That I didn't care. I mean, it's fine. It does go on for quite a while though. If you're actually like exploring and then trying to get to some of the stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's fine. I wish they would have done more, like you said, with this style of just integrating something different into these side-scrolling stages, even though like they tried it in the second stage and it didn't quite work. At least I would have had more fun with this game if they would have kept trying to do that.
Yeah, I was pleased, especially coming off the stage before. I was pleased to see it back to this style. And yeah, this is more of what I wanted. Give me my side-scrolling, Earthworm Jim. Toss in stuff like this to kind of freshen it up. I didn't have any trouble with this stage, but I mean, I was fucking taking what they could give me at this point.
Well, like I said, this stage was fun, and actually I think from this point on, with the exception of the third Peter Puppy stage that shows up again, I think the rest of the game is actually kind of what I imagined this game would be. It's like the first level is what you think the game would be, and then there's a whole bunch of stuff that's not what you think Earthworm Jim should be, and then it ends again with some fairly standard and well-made Earthworm Jim levels. The ISO 9000 is a level I wasn't a fan of necessarily, but at least it still was a 2D scrolling map exploration maze, but it's in like an office setting, so there's paper everywhere, and there's all these giant file cabinets you have to use as a ladder along with dodging their attacks, which made it very difficult, but at least that was a level. Like, it felt like an Earthworm Jim level. Mm-hmm. And then the meat level 8, where everything's like you're running through food and stuff. That reminded me of actually Rayman in many ways. But like, that level was great too. Both those levels, excellent platforming levels, and were what I imagined Earthworm Jim 2 would be. Was those levels.
Yeah, I mean, this game, when it sticks more to the original, the side-scrolling formula, is an excellent game, and very what I wanted in a sequel. But when they go off the beaten path, and like I said, I appreciate it when a developer does, but they just go too far.
Yeah, I wish they would have, those little one-off stages. Maybe if they were just a lot shorter, or just kind of put in between some of the more regular actiony stages, they would have been easier to swallow. But there's just a good chunk of the first half of the game where it's just one after another of those kinds of stages. And didn't mention that one stage where you have to actually blow up Jim's head to float him through the water level. That one wasn't exactly the greatest either. But there was just I don't know, there's just a lot of stuff here that I didn't want to play, and you have to really work to get through it, to get to the part of the game that's towards the end of the game that kind of goes back to being Earthworm Jim.
I had blacked out that level where you inflate your head. I had forgotten that level, because it's another level that it doesn't reward you for playing well, it rewards you for memorizing. And
yes.
And I'm not a giant fan of that. I mean, I know a lot of games did that. I mean, you can't play a Mega Man game and say that's not part of the game. But for some reason, in a game like Mega Man, it doesn't annoy me to the way it did in these levels that you had to memorize. That was not an enjoyable level. An interesting mechanic. I mean, the first time it happened, I was like, that's a cool thing. But then the level goes on way, way too long.
It's the whole level. And yeah, it keeps going and going. And by the time that one was finished, I was like, oh, I don't know how much more I can do with this.
Now, the last level, did you guys get to and finish the last level?
I did not get past the meat level.
Okay.
The meat level, that is where I also concluded my playing.
The meat level I enjoyed. I mean, I finished it. It was hard, but it wasn't impossible. The last level is probably my least favorite. And I hate to say it's the least favorite level in the game because I think the dog levels are way worse. But I think the end of this game has no real boss. The end of this game is just a race. It's a level where you have to make from the start of the level to the end of the level in a perfect run, because you're racing against Psychro to get to the princess, because apparently whoever gets the princess first gets to become king and therefore rule the world. It doesn't matter what the reason is, but it's another long, perfect. You have to make a perfect run on a level that you have to just try to, every time you play it, you'll get 2 inches farther as you remember that, and then you start at the beginning and you run all the way through and you get 3 inches farther and you die again, and you have to memorize that. And there are certain points like gates in the level where if you don't get there before Psychro, who a lot of the time will jump ahead of you through a secret passage or whatever, if you don't get to these certain parts before he does, he slams a gate on you, and it doesn't tell you that you're stuck, but it doesn't let you progress anymore, and you have to dodge things till eventually you die.
Oh,
and again,
I actually watched this, and it does not look very fun.
Well, it's super long, and it's not like you have unlimited chances. It's one thing if this game was like, hey, you get to the last level, here's a password, you now have unlimited chances. No, I mean, you have a number of lives, a number of continues, and every time you lose at this, you lose a life. So eventually you're going to run out of lives and have to start over the whole game to get back to this level, which means playing through those 3 damn dog stages and everything else to get back to this race and hopefully remember what you did the previous time to get farther and farther in it. Even with save states, and I didn't save state super cheat it where I got a foot farther and saved it, but still, I still didn't finish this level. And I thought this would have driven me insane with the cartridge version. If I would have gotten this far and this was the end, I never would have finished this. And I didn't finish it this time either. And I'm okay with that.
I hit that 3rd dog level, and that was the end for me. I could not. The meat level is after that, so I didn't. That's about where I got, and I was just, I can't do this anymore. But yeah, you watch a long play of it, and of course they're playing this race level with Psychro perfect, and you don't really quite get the frustration of what you're saying. So I'm kind of glad I stopped there because I probably not like this game even more than I already do.
Mm-hmm. And it's such a shame. It's such a shame. Because that first game starts off so strong, and I feel like all they had to do was just hang in there, stick to it, just give us something similar, and you would have, just like back-to-back classics.
Well, it just seems like they tried to do too many things. They tried to take this character, and they added a whole bunch of. I mean, again, if it was based on a movie or a show that it all made sense why each level was how it was, maybe I would have forced my way through it. I mean, like you mentioned Bart's Nightmare. That's a terrible game. But we all played it because we all knew the characters. We all knew the references it was coming from.
Yes.
We forced ourselves to play some terrible games. I played that Three Stooges game a million times. That game is garbage. Hot
oh my
garbage.
God, really?
But I played it a million times because I knew, I mean, my dad was a big Three Stooges fan. I knew those shorts, and I didn't have a lot of games, so what else are you going to do? But this is... It's still not terrible. Each of these games is okay. Even the ones we didn't really like aren't badly playing games. It's just there's no consistency. It just feels like I'm playing a mash of things, and then it ends. Like knowing that the end is just a race, it's like, yeah, that's it. And then the game ends. Mm-hmm. The end. That said, as much as we just complain about it, I still would say this is not a bad game necessarily. If you are a massive Earthworm Jim fan from the first one, it's worth playing this. But I don't think it holds up nearly as well as the original.
No, I mean it's not an awful game. It's not what I wanted. But I found out over the years I never get what I fucking want. But
it's fine. No, I mean it's just frustrating. It's just frustrating to see what maybe what they could have done and maybe focus more on the great things that they did in the first game instead of just pulling this weird angle to the right and doing all this crazy shit. It's just I would like to thank Billy though for bringing up Bart's Nightmare, which is officially going on my list for games for the podcast.
Oh, here we go.
Oh boy.
So we did get one good thing out of Earthworm Jim 2.
I wouldn't say we got one good thing.
Well, unfortunately, if you didn't think you liked Earthworm Jim 2, after Earthworm Jim 2 came out, or maybe the same time frame generally, Shiny was sold to Interplay. Interplay made a bunch of other games. The terrible Clay Fighter, which actually Earthworm Jim makes an appearance in, is an Interplay game. They made a lot of games that are not memorable. And they decided during the Nintendo 64 era, since everybody else had a fully 3D platformer, this was their time as well. They needed a character to do it, and Earthworm Jim seemed like the perfect choice. However, a couple issues. One, none of the original design team were involved in it in any way, shape, or form. Half the team, Doug Tendapel, who we had mentioned earlier, was kind of the voice and the character of Earthworm Jim, had already left the company. I don't believe Steve Perry. I don't believe Dave Perry was even interested in working on this game or even asked to. Steve Perry also not involved, but Dave Perry is the one that would matter.
Unfortunate.
And they wanted to make, instead of just a straight 3D platformer, which still probably would have been bad based on all the other 3D platformers that aren't Mario 64, they tried to make it more like Banjo-Kazooie, where it was a hub world with missions and all these little side things to do. And it's a mess. I did not play it for the purpose of this podcast. I remember when it came out, I did try it, and I was not pleased with it, so I didn't pick it up anymore. I thought, oh, here's another terrible 3D game. What a horrible mess. But I watched some videos of it just to remember if maybe I just don't remember it right. But I do. It's a horrible mess that is not well received by anybody. And unfortunately, that's kind of the last big hurrah for Jim. They did make a 3DS, not 3DS, a Game Boy Advanced game that was kind of a remix of the first, but I guess counts as its own new game. But that was it. This was unfortunately the last anyone had heard of Jim, was this bad 3D game, and then he vanished. In general, nothing else has happened since. But I guess there's still interest, as they did do a full HD remake 3 or 4 years ago for the Xbox 360 and PS3, which was excellent. But it's again just a HD remake of the original game.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it sucks. I mean, I just wish there was more Earthworm Jim. But going that 3D platformer route was that was the new hotness back then. What made Jim famous and what he could do really well was a 2D action platformer, and those went out of style really quick as soon as the PlayStation and Nintendo 64 hit. Mm-hmm. And his attempt, much like Bubsy 3D, it's a better attempt than Bubsy 3D. It just didn't fly, and that was it. It kind of sucks. I wish there was just something else out there with him in it.
Yeah, because I mean, in the sea of these mascot type characters, this is one of the most memorable. Still one of my favorite. And like we had said earlier in the show, this game really nailed things in the humor department, which no other game was doing at the time that well. And this is certainly a character that deserves a lot better and really to still be out there.
If you are a fan of the Earthworm Jim series and its humor, and you didn't listen to our the episode, the Neverhood episode, Skull Monkeys episode, that is about as close to an actual sequel to Earthworm Jim for the PlayStation era is what you're going to get.
Yeah, that and the even though it's a different style of game, the MDK games and Wild 9, the other things that God, he did it again, that Dave Perry put out, are very similar to humor to the original Earthworm Jim style of game. It's got it feels very similar. I mean, they're different styles of games. Wild 9 is a much more run and gun action game, but it still has some neat puzzles you use that make the levels more interesting than just straight up left to right, Contra style blasting levels. So those I highly recommend. And again, I think Skull Monkeys, you're right, dead on. That's exactly the kind of feel that the original Earthworm Jim has. But that said, I think the original Earthworm Jim on its own is a classic. Everyone should play it. If you like 2D action games at all, then there's no reason not to like Earthworm Jim.
Oh yeah.
So next episode, we're going to do something we've never done before. And it's weird in some ways because I'll do this action in games that have it as a minigame every single time, but I've never played a full-on fishing game. But Billy recommends it was Super Black Bass on the Super Nintendo.
Yeah,
that's what we're gonna do.
That's your fishing game.
I can't believe we're doing that, but at the same time, I'm actually very excited about it because after we talked about it, and I was like, I don't know how I would do that. I realized I've spent hundreds of hours fake fishing in World of Warcraft. That's not even fishing. You just click and wait on a timer. You don't do anything else. And I fished in Final Fantasy 15, and I fished in every game you can possibly fish in. So why not do it in a game specifically about fishing? So that'll be our next episode, which should show up in 2 weeks. But since the last episode we posted, there's been a major bit of retro news that we all kind of saw coming, but it's been officially announced. The Super Nintendo Classic is coming from Nintendo. It's got 21 or 22, actually a very, very solid 16-bit lineup. But I'm going to be honest, I am not interested.
No, I read this and I think I initially spoke to you guys immediately after reading this, and I think my quote to you was, "I'm so excited to not be able to ever fucking find this thing in the store." I'm just, after the NES Classic, that has just soured me, and I just, unless they are really seriously going to put out a realistic number of these, I'm certainly not going to search for this thing like I did the NES Classic. I mean, I went out of town looking for that thing. I had other people looking for it. This one, if I walk into Target one day to get some groceries and there's one there, I'll pick it up. I'm not going to put the legwork in this time. Nice lineup of games, solid lineup of games. I think the Star Fox 2 probably, if you're a fan of the first one, is probably a reason alone you might want to pick it up. But I just not excited, just not looking forward to it.
It's weird because, back the one podcast where we were talking about the first mini NES and just how excited we were about that. And none of us.
And to be brought to this.
Yeah. I saw that and I was like, well, seeing it on this webpage is probably the only time I'm ever actually going to see one. Like everyone else, I never saw a mini NES or classic edition, whatever the fuck they called it. And I went out and looked, never saw one. It sucks. You want to give Nintendo money for this stuff. It's an awesome idea. It may not be, more people may have wanted the NES, but for me, the Super Nintendo is the system I have the most nostalgia with. And this is a great selection of games. You could make the argument you could just play them on an emulator, but I would totally buy this just to have it, but I'm not going to be able to because Nintendo is just incapable of making more than a couple of thousand systems for everyone in the world to have. It's crazy just how much money they throw away.
Well, the lineup of games on it is better than the NES Classic lineup. I mean, I think NES Classic, for me personally, is a better collection because that's what I grew up playing, and those are the games I want to play. But the Super Nintendo lineup, I don't think there's a bad game on it. Honestly, I mean, there may be games I don't care for, but I can't say any of them are bad games. You got Zelda, you got Super Metroid, Super Mario World, and Earthbound. I mean, so many games that are wonderful. I mean, I'm going to say this: if I find one, I will buy it. I'm not going to be like, oh, I don't want that. I do want it. I think it's neat, but the ability to not get the original NES Classic has made it so I'm just surly about it. And the fact that Nintendo's even starting by saying, "Oh, we're only going to make a limited amount. We're going to make more than we did to the NES Classic, but it's still a short run." It's kind of part of me thinks it's not even a matter for them of I think they're going to make money on it either way. They don't care. And I think Nintendo's always been big on not making too many things because they don't want to see it in the $5 discount bin. So I get their concern in some ways. But I think for them, if they limit these things, all it's going to do is make people want to play these games. And I think the online service for the Switch is going to have that, unlimited play of a bunch of classic games they haven't listed. But why wouldn't it just be both lineups from the NES Classic and the Super Nintendo Classic? If they just put those on as their online service for the Switch, then they can say to everyone who didn't get this by the end of the year, well, sorry you didn't get this, but our new online service comes online in January, and all the games on the Classic and the Super Nintendo Classic are going to be free if you get our online service. I think for them it's win-win and free advertising.
Well, that would be very forward thinking for Nintendo, but they're, what's the chances of them ever doing anything like that? It just seems like it's just frustrating as far as someone who has some disposable income and wants stupid shit like this to not be able to just go to a store and get one. I really hope that the Switch does have a virtual console library like what you were talking about. But at the same time, I just want a tiny Super Nintendo. I wanted a tiny Nintendo. That was the main draw for me was just to kind of have those things. But it just kind of sucks to not be able to get one. I think we're just thinking, it's a cool thing, but I think we're just thinking realistically that much like the mini NES, we will never see one of these things.
Yeah. And like Jeremy P said, I'm not going to say if face to face with one, I'm going to turn it down. I'm just saying that I know I'm not going to be face to face with one. It's not going to happen. I mean, it's a damn shame. But just the NES Classic was just handled so. And I've eaten my crow over the Switch. I have. There was no crow that needed to be eaten over that NES Classic. That to go from as excited as we were to just as dejected as we were about it to, not being as excited about this thing as we should. I mean, this fucking lineup is just a kid's dream back at that time. You wished you owned all these Super Nintendo games. But yeah, don't think it's going to happen. I think it's going to be the same thing. And, by the end of the year, this thing is also going to be no longer produced, and we'll see what they do after that.
But hey, for the 10 people out there that find one of these things, you're in for a hell of a time. That's a great lineup of games.
Surprisingly, a game not on the Super Nintendo Classic is our next game, Super Black Bass, for the Super Nintendo.
Who? Someone needs to be fired. Who
made this that for the Super Nintendo Classic 2?
Yeah, we've got Super Black Bass, but I think also we may fit in maybe a little talk of some other fishing games here and there. Obviously, there's not enough time to play every fishing title out there, but and you wouldn't want to play all the fishing titles out there. But Super Black Bass, I recall being the gold standard. I had an uncle who risked going to jail over a copy of Super Black Bass, which I will talk more about next episode. But yeah, I'm excited. I'm glad Jeremy Gregory brought this up. From the second he brought up the idea of a fishing episode, I was hooked.
Oh, if you can expect more amazing puns like that. Also, that story might be the best possible advertisement for the next episode I've ever heard. I need to hear about your uncle. Now I'm going to be on it anyway, because otherwise it would be a very quiet episode of Retrovaniacs. But hopefully everyone else will tune in. I promise you a fishing game will somehow be interesting for an hour plus. Do check out our next episode. But until then, make sure to find us on retrovania.net. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter at retrovania.net, and we will see you next time.
Despite his great big muscles and his really big ray gun, Jim is still an earthworm, but then he's the only one with a super suit to make him really super strong. Jim can be a winner if we only sing along. Alright, Earthworm Jim! We think he's mighty fine. Earthworm Jim! A hero for all time! Earthworm Jim! Hooray for Jim! Groovy!